This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history at Charleston Southern University in the Citadel, as well as author and historian. And I'm here to speak about a seldom discussed and most misunderstood, if at all, period of American history called the Reconstruction Era. You see, after the fall of the Confederacy and the passing of the 13th Amendment that ended slavery throughout the country, there was a period where the federal government tried to rectify the situation in the southern states. Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which basically ended slavery in the rebel states, but he pressed for the 13th Amendment in 1865 to expand that throughout the country. Then, 3 years after he was assassinated, there was the 14th Amendment in 1868 that said all persons born on this American soil were citizens and entitled to citizenship rights regardless to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Then in 1870 was the 15th Amendment that said that all men under those categories had the right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote in the Constitution until 1920. But in either case, though, with all this happening, you had miracles thus take place throughout the South. In Louisiana, in 1873, there was a black governor named Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was also the founder of Southern University, a famous black college in that state. And in South Carolina, some really fascinating things happened. There were two African-American lieutenant governors from 1870 to 1877. The first was Alonzo Jacob Ransier, who served from 1870 to 1872. And then there was Richard Howell Gleaves, who served from 1872 to 1877. And in Charleston, South Carolina, where the federal courthouse is currently located on Meeting Street, there was a place called the Charleston Clubhouse, where from January to April 1868, 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina and bring South Carolina a true democracy that it had never had prior to this. Among the things that took place there were the following. You see, for one thing, there was Benjamin Franklin Randolph, who inserted this speech at the Constitution on February the 12th, 1868. He said that, quote, "Distinction on account of race or color in any case shall be prohibited, and all classes of citizens, irrespective of race or color, shall enjoy common, equal, and political privileges." Okay? That had never been done anywhere in the South prior to this, I should say. And Alonzo Jacob Ransier, who would later serve as the lieutenant governor, said these things. Well, he said these things, part of that. "If there's anything to which we may attribute the sufferings endured by this people, it is the gross ignorance of the masses. While we propose to avoid all difficulties which may be fraught with evil in the community, we shall nevertheless insist upon our right to provide for the exercise of the great moral agencies which education always brings to public opinion." In other words, he was saying that the reason South Carolina got into the Confederacy in the first place was because they were misled through ignorance to secede from the Union, and of course, led to the Civil War. So anyway, also along other lines, William J. Whipper, who was a lawyer who practiced on Charleston's Broad Street, had this amazing statement in during that conference. Get this, folks, and this is 1868, mind you. He said that, I tell you I know that the time will come when every man and woman in this country will have the right to vote." He was advocating that women get the right to vote. Now, that was a little bit radical even for that convention during those days, but the very next year, 1869, Wyoming allowed women the right to vote, and by 1920, as mentioned earlier, women got their full rights to vote. There was also Jonathan Jasper Wright, who would go on to become the first black state Supreme Court justice, not only in South Carolina, but anywhere in the United States. Well, anyway, he said these really interesting words. The great cry throughout the state has been, and send us teachers, and send us men and women who will teach us to read and write, and we will pay for them. The people are hungry and thirsty for knowledge. They seem to be inspired with the spirit on high that tells them that knowledge is the only source by which they can rise from the low, degraded state in which they have been kept. Note, in which they have been kept, because they were forbidden to read and write during the slavery era, although many did learn in underground schools. Well, this was going to be making it public for everyone, because in those days the only way you got an education is if you were wealthy and had private tutors, and usually if you were white too, unless you happened to go to an underground school. So Robert Smalls, who was known for, as during slavery, taking his family aboard the Confederate ship the Planter, sneaking them on there, and sailing them into freedom, on January the 23rd, 1868, he made these comments during the Constitution, and get this, this is the amendment that he passed. It said as follows: Resolved that all parents and guardians send their children between the ages of 7 and 14 to some school at least 6 months per year under penalties for noncompliance. That was the first public school law in the state of South Carolina, and that changed the course of South Carolina's history. And among other things, Francis Cardozo, who was later become the first black treasurer of South Carolina and the principal of the Avery Institute, one of the early black schools in Charleston, he had this to say. As far as making sure that these rights would be guaranteed. He warned them that there were many people in South Carolina who did not want this, and he wanted something in that Constitution solid, so that no lawyer in the future or any corrupt leader would take away their rights. And that was in the state constitution that was passed in 1868. However, ladies and gentlemen, there was the resistance to all of this. You see, the poor whites had been misled into believing that equality for the blacks meant that they would be on the bottom of society, which they didn't want. And many of the wealthy whites of that time wanted the poor whites and the blacks to serve as a permanent class of cheap labor. So they deliberately played divide and conquer among the poor so that the rich could stay rich. It's important to understand that. So the resistance of Reconstruction began not too long before all this. You see, on December the 24th, 1865, at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans gathered. They were Captain John C. Lester, Major James Crow, not to be confused with Jim Crow laws, John D. Kennedy, not to be confused with the future president, Calvin Jones, Richard Reed, and Frank McCord got together and formed the Resistance Army, what would become the Resistance Army of Reconstruction. They named the organization after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. That's how the Ku Klux Klan started. But I would be remiss if I not mention one other great accomplishment of Reconstruction in South Carolina, was that from 1873 to 1877, the University of South Carolina in Columbia was the only integrated school in the Deep South. Henry Hayne, a black man, integrated the school in 1873, and Professor Richard T. Greener, who was the first black man who graduated from Harvard, became the head of the library as well as the professor of metaphysics. And the statue to him stands there to this day. But back to the resistance, though. You had such things as the Hamburg Massacre, where a Klan-type group called the Sweetwater Sable Club that included Benjamin Tillman, a man who would later institute Jim Crow laws in South Carolina. They massacred African Americans, and throughout the state and throughout the South, you had bloody warfare between the blacks and whites. I say warfare because, contrary to popular belief, many times the blacks shot back. And as a matter of fact, in Cane Hoy, South Carolina, in October of 1876, a group of African Americans shot at a number of whites who they believed were trying to stockpile guns to kill them. And then in Charleston on November the 8th, 1876, you had African Americans as the aggressor in a political riot. So the South became filled with bloodshed, and the North became tired of this. So they passed, to make a long story short, they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise in 1877 that basically told the South that you're on your own, you can do what you want. And so you saw the erosion of many of those hard-fought rights over the next several decades, leading to segregation. But throughout all of that, contrary to popular belief, the African Americans and many of their white allies did band together, and they tried to fight back against these things. So while Reconstruction success was only short-lived, there is much that we can learn and be inspired about that success. So we could learn not to repeat the mistakes that would lead to its failure. We could also learn to build and be inspired upon what success they had. This is Damon Fordham talking about stories of Reconstruction in South Carolina.